The wind whispered through the towering iron gates as a German shepherd stood frozen, ears pricked. Just beyond, a boy with Down syndrome reached out, his eyes wide with wonder. In that moment, fate intertwined two lost souls forever. The Carter estate stood like a fortress on the outskirts of the city, a sprawling testament to wealth and isolation. Towering iron gates surrounded the mansion, keeping the world out and, in many ways, trapping those within. Behind those gates lived a boy whose world was nothing but echoes of a life others designed for him. Ethan Carter, the only son of billionaire Richard Carter, was different. And in his father's world, different had no place. Born with Down syndrome, Ethan had been a quiet storm in his father's carefully constructed life. Richard Carter, a man who built his empire on ruthless precision, could never understand his son. He had tried to fix him in the only way he knew, by throwing money at the problem. The finest tutors, therapists, and specialists walked in and out of the mansion, all speaking in hushed tones about progress, potential, and patience. But none of them truly saw Ethan. To Richard, love was measured in investments, progress reports, and carefully managed routines. But to Ethan, love was something simpler, something he had never truly known. His world was a series of structured, monotonous days, dictated by caregivers who came and went like the changing seasons. The mansion was grand, but its vast halls were silent, save for the ticking of antique clocks and the occasional echo of distant footsteps. The backyard, though breathtaking with its sculpted hedges, marble fountains, and sprawling fields, was nothing more than a gilded cage. Ethan's only real escape was the estate's towering gates, where the world outside seemed just within reach, yet impossibly far. One late afternoon, as the golden sun draped the sky in hues of amber and rose, Ethan wandered toward the gates. His small hands traced the cold iron bars as he peered into the world beyond. And then, he saw it. A dog. A German shepherd stood at a distance, its dark eyes locked onto the mansion. Its ribs were faintly visible, beneath a coat dulled by dust and time. Yet there was an undeniable strength in its posture. It did not move, did not bark, it only watched. There was something haunting in the way it stood, something that made Ethan's heart ache in a way he couldn't explain. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, the boy trapped in a world of wealth and loneliness, and the dog abandoned by a world that had no use for him. Then, without hesitation, Ethan stretched out his small hand through the bars. The dog flinched, its muscles tensing, but it did not run. Instead, it lowered its head slightly, as if contemplating whether to trust the boy before him. A moment passed, then another. Ethan smiled. And for the first time in a long while, the German shepherd wagged its tail. Shadow had once known love. His name, if he still remembered it, had been spoken with warmth once, by a voice deep and steady, belonging to a man who had always smelled of leather and sawdust. His owner had been everything to him, his whole world wrapped up in rough hands that scratched behind his ears and whispered promises of forever. But forever had ended too soon. The man had disappeared one day, leaving behind only the ghost of his scent on an old jacket. Shadow had waited until the cold crept into his bones and hunger gnawed at his ribs. But no one had come. So, he had wandered. The streets had taught him cruelty, shaped him into something sharp-edged and cautious. He learned which hands offered kindness, and which struck without warning. He had seen the best and worst of humans, and he had learned that trust was a fragile thing, too easily shattered. And yet something had pulled him toward this place, toward this boy standing behind iron bars. There was an innocence in the boy's eyes, a quiet longing that Shadow recognized too well. They were both waiting for something they couldn't name. That night, Shadow curled up near the gates, his ears twitching at every sound, half expecting to be chased away. But the morning came, and no one had come to shoo him off. By sunrise, Ethan was back. This time, he carried something in his tiny Hansa sandwich wrapped carefully in a napkin. He crouched by the gate, his face lighting up as he pushed the food through the bars, waiting patiently as Shadow sniffed the offering. Hunger overpowered hesitation. Shadow inched forward, taking the food with careful bites, his rough tongue brushing against Ethan's soft fingers. The boy giggled, a sound so pure that it startled the dog. This became their ritual. Every morning, Ethan would sneak whatever food he could manage, and every morning Shadow would be there waiting. A bond formed between them, quiet and unspoken, built on shared loneliness and simple gestures of kindness. But the walls of wealth were not meant to be broken so easily. And soon, someone would notice. Someone who would not understand. And when that happened, everything would change. A bond that was never meant to be. The days turned into weeks, and the quiet understanding between Ethan and Shadow grew into something unbreakable. Each morning, Ethan would rush to the gates, his small hands gripping whatever food he could steal from the breakfast table. Some days it was a piece of toast, other days a bit of scrambled egg wrapped carefully in a napkin. It wasn't much, but it was given with love. And Shadow took it with the reverence of a starving soul receiving salvation. The dog never left the estate's gate, not completely. He wandered, yes, disappearing into the nearby woods at times, but he always returned before nightfall, curling up against the cold iron bars as if the boy's presence was the only thing anchoring him to this world. Ethan, too, had changed. His world, once defined by structured routines and the quiet loneliness of being an afterthought in a house too big for love, had suddenly become something worth waking up for. His tutors noticed his newfound enthusiasm. His caregivers whispered about how he smiled more, but none of them knew why. None of them saw the reason for the light in his eyes, the stray dog that had become his first real friend. But secrets are fragile things, and in a house built on control, nothing stayed hidden for long. One afternoon, Ethan sat cross-legged by the gate, his fingers gripping the metal as he hummed softly. Shadow was just outside, his tail wagging lazily, his ears perked at the boy's voice. The two of them had built a language of their own, one that didn't need words. Then came the voice that shattered everything. "Ethan, step away from that gate." The boy stiffened, his small hands tightening against the bars. He knew that voice. Richard Carter, his father. The man's presence was as suffocating as ever, his towering frame dressed in a pristine navy suit, his expression a mixture of confusion and irritation. His sharp gaze flickered between his son and the ragged creature beyond the gate. Shadow felt it before Ethan did the shift in the air, the crackling of impending doom. His tail lowered, his body stiffening. Ethan turned slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had never been afraid of his father exactly, but he had long since learned that Richard Carter's world was one of expectations Ethan could never meet. His father sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "What are you doing?" Ethan swallowed, his fingers still curled around the bars. His voice was quiet but firm. "Feeding him." Richard's expression darkened. He took a step forward, towering over his son. "Ethan, that's a stray. You don't know where it's been. It could be dangerous." At that, Ethan turned fully, his small body shielding Shadow as much as it could. He shook his head. "He's not dangerous. He's my friend." Richard exhaled sharply, glancing at the dog as if it were nothing more than an inconvenience. "You are not to come near it again. Do you understand me?" Ethan's grip tightened against the bars. His world, which had finally started to feel full, was shrinking again. "Please," he whispered. "He has nowhere else to go." Richard's expression didn't soften. If anything, it hardened. "Neither do wild animals. That doesn't mean you bring them home." Ethan's lip trembled, but he held his ground. "He's not wild." Richard didn't have time for this. With a sigh of frustration, he turned to one of the estate guards standing nearby. "Get rid of it." The words crashed down like a hammer. Ethan's entire body went rigid. Shadow, sensing the shift, let out a low growl of warning. But it was helpless against the weight of power that surrounded them. Before Ethan could react, before he could beg, before he could scream, the guards moved forward. Shadow took a step back, then another. His instincts, honed by years of abandonment, screamed at him to run. And then, with one last glance at Ethan, the boy who had given him hope, Shadow turned and fled. Ethan watched him disappear, his chest tight with something he had never known before. Rage. A dangerous discovery. The moment Richard Carter realized his son was missing, the entire mansion erupted into chaos. The estate guards were mobilized, flashlights cutting through the darkness as they searched the grounds. The staff whispered amongst themselves, worry etched into their faces. And Richard, usually composed and unreadable, stood in the center of it all, his hands clenched into fists, his face pale with something he refused to name. Panic. He had never truly feared losing Ethan before. The boy was always contained, controlled. But now, he was gone, and Richard had no idea where to start looking. His mind raced. Had someone taken him? Had he wandered off? Then, a single thought struck him. The dog. His stomach twisted. Ethan had risked everything for that stray. Would he have gone after it? The realization sent Richard into motion. Without waiting for confirmation, he barked orders to the guards. Check the roads. Check the security cameras. Find him. Time was slipping away. And for the first time in years, Richard felt something foreign clawing at his chest. Regret. The rescue. But at what cost? Ethan had just begun to realize the weight of what he had done when the distant wail of sirens pierced the air. His small fingers clenched around Shadow's fur as panic set in. They were looking for him. His father was looking for him. He wanted to stay. He wanted to hide. But he couldn't. Not for long. The alley was too exposed, too close to the main road. If he stayed here, they would find him, and Shadow they would take him away again. Ethan looked down at his friend, heart pounding. He had fought so hard to find him. He couldn't lose him again. Making a decision, he stood up, wiping his face with his sleeve. "Come on," he whispered. "We have to go." Shadow hesitated but followed. He always would. Together, they slipped out of the alley, moving deeper into the city, away from the flashing lights and the voices calling Ethan's name. For a while, they walked in silence. Ethan didn't know where he was going. He just knew he couldn't stop. But the world was vast, and he was small, and soon exhaustion caught up to him. His legs ached. His breaths came in short gasps. His body, unaccustomed to this kind of strain, began to slow. And then, headlights. Bright, blinding headlights. A black car screeched to a stop in front of them. Ethan barely had time to register the door swinging open before strong hands grabbed him. He barely had time to cry out before he was being pulled into an embrace. His father's embrace. Richard Carter held onto his son tightly, his body rigid, his breath uneven. For a long moment, he didn't speak. He just held him. Ethan, still in shock, barely registered the warmth. Then came the words, sharp and edged with something Ethan had never heard before. Fear. "What were you thinking?" Richard's voice was low, trembling. "Do you have any idea you even understand?" Ethan blinked up at his father, suddenly unsure. This wasn't the cold businessman he knew. This wasn't the distant man who always looked past him. This was someone else. Someone afraid. His lips parted, but no words came. Richard exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "You could have gotten hurt. You could have—" He swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. Ethan had never seen his father like this before. And for the first time, a tiny part of him wondered if maybe, just maybe, his father cared more than he let on. But then, his eyes flickered past Richard, and his heart stopped. Shadow. The guards had him. 2 men held onto the dog, ropes looped around his neck like a leash. Shadow didn't fight, but his ears were flattened, his eyes locked onto Ethan with silent desperation. Not again. Ethan wrenched out of his father's grip, stumbling forward. "Don't!" he cried, his voice breaking. "Please, he's my friend." Richard's expression hardened. He followed his son's gaze to the dog and sighed. "Ethan, this has gone far enough." "No." Ethan's voice was stronger now. "I won't leave him." Silence. Ethan's small chest heaved, his fists clenched at his sides. For the first time in his life, he was standing his ground. And for the first time, Richard didn't have an immediate response. The weight of the moment hung between them. Then, slowly, Ethan did something unexpected. He reached out not for Shadow, but for his father's hand. Richard stiffened. Ethan's voice was barely a whisper. "Please." And something inside Richard Carter shifted. He looked at his son, the boy he had never quite understood. The boy who had always been a puzzle he didn't know how to solve. Then he looked at the dog, the stray that had somehow filled a space Richard never realized was empty. The choice was his. And for once in his life, Richard Carter chose something other than control. "Let him go." The guards hesitated. Richard nodded. "Let him go." And just like that, everything changed. A world beyond the gates. Ethan had never been beyond the iron gates alone. His father's world was one of security, walls, and boundaries, physical and invisible. But now, for the first time, he was running past them, his breath coming in short, uneven gasps. The city loomed ahead, distant lights flickering against the dark sky. His small feet pounded against the pavement as he crossed the estate's long driveway and slipped into the unfamiliar streets beyond. Shadow was out there. He had to find him. The night air was crisp, filled with the distant hum of passing cars and the rustling of leaves in the wind. Everything felt bigger, louder, and colder than he expected. Fear clawed at his chest, but he shoved it down. This wasn't about fear. This was about finding the only soul who had ever looked at him and truly seen him. He turned a corner, his heart racing. Where would Shadow go? The dog had always lingered near the estate, never straying too far. Maybe he was still close. Maybe he was waiting. Ethan's breath hitched as he spotted a set of muddy paw prints near the edge of the sidewalk, faint but unmistakable. His heart leapt. Shadow. Following the trail, he moved deeper into the quiet neighborhood, past darkened storefronts and empty alleyways. Every sound made him flinch, a car engine rumbling in the distance, the distant chatter of strangers. But he pressed on. He had to. Then, he saw it. A small figure curled up near a dumpster in a narrow alley, hidden in the shadows. Shadow. Relief flooded Ethan as he sprinted forward, dropping to his knees beside the dog. Shadow lifted his head, ears twitching, his dark eyes weary but alert. When he saw Ethan, his tail gave a weak wag. "You're okay," Ethan whispered, reaching out with trembling fingers. Shadow hesitated for only a second before pressing his head into the boy's hands. The warmth, the familiarity, it was the only comfort either of them had known in a long time. Ethan buried his face in the dog's fur, hot tears spilling down his cheeks. "I'm sorry," he choked out. "I didn't want them to send you away." Shadow let out a soft whine, licking Ethan's cheek as if to say, "It's okay, you found me." For a long time, they just sat there, the boy and the dog huddled together in the dimly lit alley. Two lost souls, abandoned in different ways, but never truly alone as long as they had each other. But the night was growing colder, and reality was beginning to creep in. Ethan had left home. No one knew where he was, and sooner or later, someone would notice. His father would notice, and when that happened, everything would come crashing down. A fragile hope. The moment the rope slipped from around Shadow's neck, he didn't move. He stood still, ears perked, dark eyes flickering between Ethan and the guards who had once restrained him. He didn't trust it. Freedom was never given so easily. Ethan, however, had no hesitation. The second Shadow was released. The boy threw himself forward, wrapping his small arms around the dog's thick neck. Shadow let out a deep, relieved breath, pressing into Ethan, feeling the warmth of the only human who had ever treated him like he mattered. For the first time in a long while, Shadow had a home. Richard Carter watched the exchange in silence, his hands in his pockets, his face unreadable. The city lights cast long shadows over his features, but something in his gaze had softened. Maybe it was the way Ethan held the dog so tightly, as if letting go would shatter him. Maybe it was the realization that this was the first time he had ever seen his son fight for something. Or maybe, just maybe, it was because Ethan reminded him of someone. His wife. The thought came unbidden, sharp and painful. Emily would have done the same thing. She had always been the one with the gentle heart, the one who saw past titles and wealth and into the souls of things. She had once picked up a dying bird from the side of the road, nursing it back to health despite knowing it would never survive long in the wild. "Everything deserves a second chance, Richard," she had told him. "Even the things the world has given up on." The memory made something tighten in his chest. And now here was Ethan, standing in front of him, making the same plea. Was this Emily's legacy? Richard let out a slow breath, dragging a hand down his face. "Fine," he muttered. "The dog stays." Ethan's head snapped up. Hope flickered in his wide eyes. "Really?" Richard sighed. "Yes, but he stays outside. He's not a house pet." Ethan beamed, hugging Shadow tighter. "Thank you." The gratitude in his son's voice made Richard's stomach twist. It shouldn't take this much for his own child to thank him. When had things become so broken? Shaking off the thought, Richard turned toward the waiting car. "Let's go home." As Ethan led Shadow into the back seat beside him, Richard caught himself staring at the boy's face in the reflection of the window. For the first time, he wondered if he had been looking at his son the wrong way all along. A promise broken. The following days were some of the happiest Ethan had ever known. Shadow was given a place in the backyard, a soft blanket to sleep on, and regular meals. It wasn't much, but it was better than the streets. More than that, he had Ethan. Every morning the boy would wake up early to sit beside Shadow, talking to him in hushed tones about his dreams, his thoughts, his world. And though Shadow could not speak, he listened, always. For the first time, Ethan didn't feel alone. But happiness, like all fragile things, never lasted long in the Carter household. Richard Carter was a man of order, and a stray dog did not fit into his carefully curated life. It started with the small things, the disapproving glances, the reminders that Shadow was still an animal, that he didn't belong in their world. Then came the argument. It was a cold evening, and Ethan was curled up next to Shadow under the patio lights when Richard stepped outside, his jaw tight. Inside Ethan. The boy hesitated, glancing down at Shadow. "Can he come?" Richard exhaled. The answer was already decided before the question was even asked. "Number, I told you he stays outside." Ethan's shoulders slumped, but he nodded, pressing a quick kiss against Shadow's head before rising to his feet. He had learned not to fight. Fighting never worked. But Shadow had learned something else. That night, he didn't stay outside. Long after Ethan had gone to bed, the German Shepherd slipped through the open patio door, padding silently across the polished floors of the Carter mansion. He had spent too long in the cold, too long without warmth, and the scent of Ethan, the only comfort he had known, was stronger here. So he followed it. He found Ethan curled up in his massive bed, breathing softly in his sleep. Shadow hesitated only for a second before stepping forward and curling up beside him, pressing his body against the boy's small frame. For the first time in a long time, they both slept without fear. Until morning came. Until Richard found them. The moment he stepped into Ethan's room and saw the stray sprawled out on the pristine white sheets, everything shattered. "What the hell is this?" His voice was sharp, cutting. Ethan jolted awake, eyes wide. Shadow, sensing danger, leaped off the bed, his ears flattened. Richard's face was unreadable, but his hands were clenched at his sides. This was the last straw. "I told you," his voice was dangerously low, "he stays outside." Ethan scrambled out of bed, shielding Shadow with his small body. "He didn't mean to," he pleaded. "Please, Dad, he's just cold." Richard's jaw tensed. His patience, already worn thin, snapped. "That's it. The dog is leaving." The words sliced through Ethan's chest like a knife. "Number, not again." Tears burned in his eyes as he shook his head. "Number, you promised." "I changed my mind." The betrayal was instant. Ethan's heart pounded so hard it hurt. "You said he could stay." Richard exhaled harshly. "And I was wrong. He's an animal, Ethan. He doesn't belong here." Ethan took a step back, his whole body trembling. "He belongs with me." Silence. For a brief moment, Richard saw something in Ethan's face that stopped him cold. It wasn't just sadness. It was anger. The same quiet, unyielding anger he had once seen in Emily when she had fought for the things she believed in. For the first time, Richard Carter felt like he wasn't speaking to a child. He was speaking to his son. But it didn't matter. Richard turned toward the waiting guards. "Take the dog," Ethan screamed. The sound was raw, broken, filled with something Richard had never heard from him before. Not just sadness, not just desperation. Hatred. Shadow, sensing Ethan's distress, let out a deep, threatening growl as the guards stepped forward. His instincts kicked him would fight. But Ethan, who had always been quiet, always been obedient, always been small, stepped in front of him. Richard's breath caught. Ethan spread his arms wide, blocking the guards, his small frame trembling. "You're not taking him." His voice was quiet but firm. And Richard Carter, a man who had commanded boardrooms, who had made and destroyed empires, had no idea what to do with a 7-year-old boy who had finally learned how to say no. For a long moment, no one moved. Ethan's chest heaved. Shadow stayed tense behind him, waiting. And Richard Carter had a choice. He could force his son aside. He could take the dog, make the decision, end this once and for all. Or he could listen. For once in his life he could listen. But Richard Carter was not a man who changed so easily. And so, without another word, he turned his back. He walked away. And as the guards reached forward, as Ethan screamed again, as Shadow let out a heart-wrenching whine, The promise Richard had made was shattered, and with it, something inside his son broke too. The house was silent, but inside Ethan, a storm raged. He sat curled up in the corner of his room, his arms wrapped tightly around his knees, his body trembling with the force of emotions he didn't know how to control. Anger, sadness, betrayal. Shadow was gone. They had taken him, and his own father, had done nothing to stop it. Ethan's chest ached with something he had never felt before. It was deeper than sadness, heavier than anger. It was loss. Because this wasn't just about a dog. This was about everything. Every ignored conversation, every disappointed sigh, every moment Richard Carter had looked at him and seen a burden instead of a son. Ethan had fought for the first time in his life. He had stood his ground, raised his voice, and it hadn't mattered. Tears slipped down his cheeks, silent but endless. The world outside his window was dark, the estate's garden stretching into the night like a dream just out of reach. Somewhere beyond those walls, Shadow was alone, cold, afraid, just like before, just like Ethan. The door creaked open, and soft footsteps entered the room. Margaret, the head caretaker, the only adult in the house who had ever been kind to him. She knelt beside him, brushing the hair from his damp face. "Oh, sweetheart." Her voice was filled with quiet sorrow. Ethan didn't move, didn't speak. Margaret sighed, her own heart aching for the child she had watched grow up in a house too empty to hold real love. "Your father thought he was doing what was best," she whispered. Ethan flinched. A fresh wave of anger surged through him, sharp and hot. Best? How could taking away the only thing that had ever made him feel whole be the best thing? His breath hitched as his small hands curled into fists. Where did they take him? His voice was hoarse, cracked from crying. Margaret hesitated. The city shelter. Ethan's head snapped up. His lips parted as a horrifying realization sank in. City shelters didn't keep dogs forever. They put them down. Margaret must have seen the panic in his wide, tear-streaked eyes because she quickly reached for his hands. "Sweetheart, listen to me. There's still time. The shelter won't do anything right away." But Ethan wasn't listening. He had to go. His small body trembled as he rose to his feet, his breath coming fast and uneven. Shadow was out there, waiting for him, scared, alone, just like Ethan was before they met. He had to save him. He turned toward the door, but Margaret gently held his arm. "Ethan, you can't just—" He met her gaze with a fire she had never seen before. This wasn't a child's tantrum. This was something deeper, something desperate. "I have to," he whispered. Margaret exhaled slowly. Then, against everything she had been trained to do, everything she had been ordered to do, she nodded. "Go," she whispered. And Ethan ran. The night air hit him like ice as he slipped out through the back doors. The estate was vast, its walls high, but Ethan knew the gaps, the hidden places where security cameras didn't reach. For the first time, his father's indifference worked in his favor. The streets were unfamiliar, the world beyond the gates larger than he had ever imagined, but he didn't care. He ran, past the quiet houses, past the dimly lit shops. His legs ached, his chest burned, but he pushed forward, because he wasn't just running toward Shadow. He was running toward the only thing that had ever truly been his. The city shelter loomed ahead, a gray building with chain-link fences and flickering streetlights. Ethan's heart pounded against his ribs. Would he be too late? He didn't stop to think. He pushed open the shelter door, breathless, his eyes wide with fear. The woman at the front desk blinked at him in surprise. "Sweetheart, are you lost?" Ethan shook his head, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm here for my dog." The woman hesitated, clearly unsure of what to do. "Your parents?" "Number not them. Not now." Ethan didn't wait for permission. He turned and ran past the front desk, down the hall, past row after row of kennels filled with frightened, abandoned souls. And then, there, Shadow. His ears perked at the sight of Ethan, his tail thumping weakly against the metal cage. His dark eyes, once filled with so much sadness, lit up. Ethan's vision blurred with tears. "I'm here," he whispered. His fingers reached through the bars, brushing against Shadow's fur. For the first time since they had been torn apart, Ethan felt whole again. But he wasn't free yet. Footsteps echoed behind him, the shelter staff, the world that had never understood him. They would take him away again. Unless Ethan did something he had never done before. Unless he refused to let go. Ethan's fingers curled around the cold metal bars of Shadow's kennel, his small chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. He had made it. He had found him. But the battle wasn't over yet. Shadow let out a low whine, pressing his nose against the cage door. His tail thumped against the floor, weak but hopeful. He had been waiting. Ethan wiped at his face with his sleeve, willing himself not to cry again. He had come this far. He wasn't going to lose him now. Footsteps, loud, urgent. The woman from the front desk rushed toward him, a man in a shelter uniform following close behind. "Sweetheart," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. "You can't be back here. Where are your parents?" Ethan flinched. Not them. Not now. The man frowned. "How did you even get in here?" Ethan ignored the question. He turned to the woman, his small hands gripping the bars so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Please," he whispered. "He's my dog." The woman hesitated. "Honey, this is a shelter. The animals here don't belong to anyone." But Shadow did. Ethan shook his head violently. "He belongs to me." His voice cracked. "They took him away." The man glanced at the clipboard in his hands, flipping through paperwork. "The German Shepherd? He was brought in last night." Ethan's stomach twisted. "Are you going to—" He swallowed hard, unable to finish the sentence. The woman sighed, crouching down to meet his eye level. "Sweetheart, I don't know what happened, but if the dog was brought here by an owner or animal control, we have to follow procedures. Unless someone comes to claim him, we can't just— I'm claiming him." His voice was strong, steady. The woman blinked in surprise. The man shifted uncomfortably. "Kid, it's not that simple." But Ethan wasn't backing down. Not this time. "Please," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "He's the only friend I have." Silence stretched between them. The woman's face softened. The man, however, shook his head. "Look, even if we wanted to, we can't release a dog to a child. We'd need a parent or guardian." The front door burst open. The room filled with the sound of heavy footsteps, voices, the sharp click of polished shoes against the tile floor. And then, Richard Carter. Ethan's heart plummeted. His father stood in the entrance, flanked by two of his security guards, his expression unreadable. His sharp eyes scanned the room until they landed on his son, disheveled, tear-streaked, and standing defiantly in front of a kennel. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Richard let out a slow breath and muttered, "I should have known." Ethan tensed, bracing himself for the inevitable, the scolding, the anger, the decision made without his say. The shelter woman straightened. "Sir, I assume this is your child?" Richard nodded, his jaw tight. "Yes." Ethan's stomach twisted. This was it. This was the moment his father would take him away, and Shadow would be left behind forever. But he couldn't let that happen. Before his father could say another word, Ethan stepped forward, his entire body shaking. "You can't take me without him." Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. "Ethan, no." Ethan shook his head furiously, stepping between his father and the kennel. "You don't get to decide this. You don't get to take everything away from me." Richard blinked, clearly not expecting the outburst. "Ethan, we'll discuss this at home." "No." The boy's voice cracked, but his resolve held. "You don't listen. You never listen." The words echoed through the shelter, cutting through the thick tension in the air. Richard's expression flickered, just for a second. The woman and the shelter worker stood frozen, watching the confrontation unfold. Ethan's small fists clenched at his sides. His voice was barely a whisper now. "You never hear me. You never see me. But Shadow does." Silence. Richard exhaled through his nose, glancing at the dog, at the way he stared at Ethan, unwavering, loyal, waiting. Then, for the first time, Richard Carter truly saw. A father's choice. Richard had always been a man of logic, of numbers, of control. His entire life had been built on strategy, wealth, power, efficiency. But now, standing in a dingy city shelter, faced with his own son's tear-streaked, furious face, none of that mattered. He had always thought Ethan was fragile, that he needed protection, that he wouldn't understand the world the way Richard did. But the boy standing before him wasn't weak. He was brave, and he was fighting for something Richard had never given him the space to fight for before, something Richard had never fought for himself. Richard let out a long, slow breath. Then, before he could change his mind, he turned to the shelter worker. "What do I need to do to take the dog home?" The entire room stilled. Ethan sucked in a sharp breath, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You mean—" Richard didn't look at him. He kept his gaze locked on the shelter employee, his voice steady. "What's the adoption process?" The woman blinked, clearly caught off guard. Well, normally there's an application process, a waiting period. Skip it." Richard's voice left no room for argument. "I'll make a donation. Name your price." The man beside her frowned. "Sir, it's not just about money." "Then what?" Richard snapped. "You need assurance? Papers? Fine. Whatever it takes, I'll do it." Ethan stared at his father like he was seeing him for the first time. This wasn't control. This wasn't dismissal. This was something else entirely. This was effort. The woman hesitated. Then, after a long moment, she sighed. "If you're willing to officially adopt the dog and sign the necessary forms, we can expedite the process." Richard nodded. "Then do it." Ethan let out a small, choked sound, his fingers gripping the fabric of his shirt. "He's coming home?" Richard turned to his son, his expression softer than Ethan had ever seen it. The walls between them weren't gone, but maybe, just maybe, they were starting to crack. "Yes." Ethan didn't think. He just moved. He threw himself forward, wrapping his arms around his father for the first time in years. Richard stiffened. For a split second, he looked completely lost. Then, slowly, awkwardly, he returned the hug. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't everything, but it was a start. And as Ethan pulled away, turning back to Shadow with a beaming, tearful smile, Richard let out a quiet breath. For the first time in a long, long time, he had made the right choice. The drive back to the Carter estate was quiet, but it wasn't the same kind of silence Ethan had grown used to. This time, it wasn't cold or distant. It was peaceful. Shadow sat in the back seat with Ethan, his head resting on the boy's lap, his tail occasionally thumping against the leather seat. He was safe. Ethan still couldn't quite believe it. His fingers ran gently through the dog's thick fur, his mind replaying the moment his father had spoken the words he never thought he'd hear. "He's coming home." He looked up at Richard, who was driving with an expression that was unreadable, but different, less rigid, less closed off. His grip on the steering wheel was firm, but for once he didn't seem miles away, lost in his own world. Ethan swallowed hard before speaking. "Thank you." Richard glanced at him in the rearview mirror, something flickering in his gaze. "For what?" Ethan hesitated, his small fingers tightening around Shadow's fur. He didn't know how to say everything that was swirling in his chest. "Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for listening. Thank you for letting me fight for something and not taking it away." Instead, he just whispered, "For Shadow." Richard didn't answer right away. He exhaled slowly, his hands flexing against the wheel. "I was wrong," he admitted. "About a lot of things." Ethan's breath caught. His father never admitted when he was wrong. Richard continued, his voice quieter now. "I thought I was protecting you by making all the decisions, by controlling everything." He paused. "But I wasn't. I was just keeping you out." Ethan looked down, blinking hard. This was the first real conversation they had ever had. Richard sighed. I can't change everything overnight, but I can start with this. Ethan looked up again, his heart pounding. What does that mean? Richard glanced at Shadow in the rearview mirror, then back at his son. It means he stays. Not just in the yard, not just outside. Ethan's breath hitched. You mean, he's your dog, Richard said simply. And if he's yours, then he belongs in the house, with you. Tears welled in Ethan's eyes, but this time, they weren't from sadness. They were from something warm and unfamiliar. Hope. He didn't say anything. He just leaned down and pressed his forehead against Shadow's, feeling the steady rise and fall of the dog's breath. They had won. A home for both of them. When they arrived at the mansion, the security guards at the gate blinked in surprise at the sight of the dog trotting alongside Ethan like he had always belonged there. No one said anything. No one dared to. Ethan led Shadow through the grand entrance, his hands buried in the dog's fur, his heart racing. He half expected his father to change his mind, to decide at the last second that this was a mistake. But Richard simply walked in behind them, loosened his tie, and gestured toward the living room. Come on, he said. I suppose we should see where he wants to sleep. Ethan grinned. For the first time in his life, the mansion actually felt like home. Margaret, the caretaker, appeared in the hallway, her sharp gaze landing on the dog. Her eyes flicked toward Richard, waiting for the inevitable command to send him back outside. But when Richard said nothing, she tilted her head in quiet approval. Well, it's about time, she murmured. Ethan beamed. That night, for the first time in years, he slept without feeling alone. Shadow curled up beside him, his large frame pressed against Ethan's small one. The steady rhythm of his breathing lulled the boy into a deep, peaceful sleep. And for the first time in a long while, Richard Carter stood in the doorway of his son's room, watching. For years, he had kept himself at a distance, convincing himself that it was for the best, that Ethan needed discipline, structure, control. But now, standing there, watching his son sleep soundly for the first time in years, he realized he had been wrong. And for the first time, he allowed himself to wonder. Maybe his son had been the one teaching him all along. A new beginning weeks passed, and life at the Carter estate changed in small but profound ways. Ethan no longer ate alone. Shadow was always beside him, and more often than not, Richard sat at the table too. The house, once filled with cold silence, now had the soft sounds of paws against marble floors, the occasional bark of excitement, and, most importantly, the laughter of a boy who had once thought happiness was out of reach. Ethan no longer tiptoed around his father. He spoke. He asked questions. He shared stories. And, slowly but surely, Richard listened. One afternoon, Ethan and Shadow played in the backyard, the boy laughing as the German shepherd chased after a ball. Richard watched from the patio, a cup of coffee in hand, Margaret standing beside him. "You're different," she noted. Richard exhaled, watching his son with quiet thoughtfulness. "I'm trying." Margaret nodded approvingly. Emily would be proud. Richard's throat tightened. He hadn't heard his late wife's name spoken aloud in a long time. He looked at Ethan, his son, his blood, the boy he had spent so long keeping at arm's length, and for the first time, he stopped trying to turn Ethan into something he wasn't. Instead, he let himself love the boy exactly as he was. The way Emily always had, the way Shadow did, the way Ethan had deserved all along. Final scene. A quiet moment. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan sat on the front steps of the mansion, Shadow resting beside him. His father joined him, something that would have been unheard of just a few months ago. For a while, neither of them spoke. But it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was peaceful. Richard finally cleared his throat. "You really love that dog, don't you?" Ethan smiled, running his fingers through Shadow's fur. "He saved me. Richard looked at his son, at the quiet strength he had never noticed before. "Maybe you saved each other." Ethan turned to him, his eyes searching. "Are you happy, Dad?" Richard exhaled, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. Happiness had never been something he thought about. It had always been about success, about control. But now, he looked at Ethan, at Shadow, at the life that had quietly grown in the spaces where loneliness used to live. He reached out, hesitating only for a second before ruffling his son's hair. "I think I'm getting there." Ethan grinned. And as the last light of day faded into the night, the Carter estate, once nothing more than a house, finally became a home. Some bonds are unbreakable. Some friendships change us in ways we never expect. Ethan and Shadow's story is proof that love isn't measured in wealth or power. It's found in the quiet moments, in the ones who see us for who we truly are. What would you fight for if no one else believed in it? Have you ever had a bond that changed your life? Tell us in the comments below. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories. Because sometimes, the most unexpected friendships change everything.